The fastest way to embarrass yourself is to underestimate someone who has nothing to prove. The laughter started near the center of the ballroom and spread outward like ripples across a still lake. Crystal glasses reflected the warm golden light hanging from massive chandeliers. Waiters moved quietly between tables draped in white linen. A string quartet played softly near the stage. Everything about the evening was designed to project elegance, success, and influence. More than 300 guests filled the grand ballroom of the Holloway Foundation annual charity gala in downtown Manhattan. CEOs, politicians, investors, media personalities. The people who appeared regularly on magazine covers and business networks. At the center of it all stood Richard Holloway, 48 years old, billionaire investor, founder of one of the largest private investment firms in the country. He wore a custom navy suit and a smile that usually convinced people he was the smartest person in any room. Tonight, he was enjoying the attention. The gala was his event, his stage, his audience. Across the room, moving quietly between tables carrying a silver tray, was Grace Mitchell, 31 years old. White waitress, blonde hair secured neatly in a low bun, black uniform, white apron. She blended into the background the way service staff often did at events like these. Most guests never looked twice at her. Grace preferred it that way. She focused on her work and avoided unnecessary conversation. She had been serving guests for nearly 4 hours without incident. The evening would have remained ordinary if Richard Holloway had not noticed her. It happened during a live fundraising segment. Richard stood on the stage thanking donors and making light-hearted jokes between announcements. The crowd responded exactly as expected. Then his attention drifted toward Grace as she passed near the front of the room carrying coffee service. An idea appeared in his mind. The kind of idea that always received laughs. The kind of idea nobody ever challenged. Richard pointed casually toward her. "Excuse me," he said into the microphone. Grace stopped and turned. Hundreds of eyes followed his gesture. "Yes, sir?" she asked politely. Richard smiled. "You have been listening all night. Maybe you can help us settle something." A few people chuckled. Grace remained still. "I can try," she said. More laughter followed. The audience already understood the setup. Richard continued. "Tell me, if someone spends 20 years building a billion-dollar company and another person spends 20 years carrying trays at charity events, who made better use of their time?" The ballroom erupted with laughter. Some guests covered their mouths. Others openly grinned. The question was designed to create a reaction. Everyone knew it. Grace stood alone under the attention of hundreds of strangers. The spotlight from the stage partially illuminated her face. Richard waited confidently. He expected embarrassment, maybe nervous laughter, maybe silence. Instead, Grace simply looked at him, calmly, respectfully, without anger, without fear. The laughter gradually faded. Something about her expression felt different. She did not look offended. She did not look intimidated. She looked as though she was considering the question seriously. Richard noticed the change immediately. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across his face. Only for a second. Then it disappeared behind another smile. "Come on," he said. "It is a simple question." Grace adjusted her grip on the tray. Around the room, people leaned forward slightly. Some expected her to stumble. Others wanted to see how she would escape the situation. The musicians had stopped playing. Even the waitstaff seemed frozen. Grace finally spoke. Her voice was soft enough that people instinctively became quieter to hear it. "That depends," she said, "on whether the goal of those 20 years was money or meaning." The room became completely silent. Richard's smile remained in place. But for the first time all evening, it no longer looked effortless. The silence lingered for several seconds after Grace spoke. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was something stranger. The kind that appears when a room full of people suddenly realizes a conversation is no longer moving in the direction they expected. Richard Holloway remained on stage holding the microphone. His smile was still there, but it had become noticeably tighter. Around the ballroom, guests exchanged glances. Some looked amused. Others looked thoughtful. A few seemed unsure whether they should laugh anymore. Grace stood quietly beside a table near the front of the room, her silver coffee tray balanced comfortably against her side. She had not raised her voice. She had not challenged Richard. She had simply answered his question. Richard gave a small chuckle. "Meaning versus money," he said. "That is a clever answer." Several guests laughed politely. The reaction felt weaker than before. Richard noticed it immediately. He had spent decades reading rooms. He understood audience energy better than most politicians. The momentum had shifted, even if only slightly. But let us be realistic, he continued. Meaning does not pay mortgages. Meaning does not build companies. Meaning does not employ thousands of people. A few guests nodded. The room seemed ready to move back toward familiar territory. Richard felt control returning. Then Grace spoke again. Neither does money, she said calmly. The ballroom grew quiet once more. Richard tilted his head. I beg your pardon. Grace maintained her respectful expression. Money is a tool, she said. People build companies. People employ people. Money simply helps organize the process. A murmur spread across several nearby tables. Richard felt a flicker of irritation. Not because she was rude. She was not. That was precisely the problem. She continued answering without giving him anything to attack. Interesting, Richard said. And what exactly qualifies you to explain business to a room full of executives? The question drew a few nervous laughs. Grace looked down briefly at the tray in her hands before lifting her eyes back toward him. Nothing, she replied. I am only answering the questions you asked. More silence followed. Somewhere near the back of the ballroom, someone laughed softly. Not at Grace. At the situation. Richard heard it. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The evening had been carefully planned. Every detail, every speech, every announcement, every donor recognition. He was accustomed to guiding conversations exactly where he wanted them to go. Yet somehow a waitress carrying coffee had disrupted the rhythm of the entire event. Richard stepped away from the podium and moved closer to the edge of the stage. Let me ask you something else, he said. You seem thoughtful. Tell me this. If success is not measured by money, what should it be measured by? The room leaned in. Grace paused before answering. Not because she was intimidated. Because she appeared to take the question seriously. By what remains after the money is gone, she said. The words landed differently this time. There was no laughter. No immediate reaction. Just hundreds of people processing the answer. Richard glanced around the ballroom. He saw expressions changing. Investors. Executives. Donors. People who had spent their lives chasing larger numbers. Larger valuations. Larger portfolios. For the first time all evening, he felt something unexpected. Not embarrassment. Not yet. But resistance. The audience was no longer following him automatically. They were listening to her. Grace remained exactly where she had been from the beginning. Calm. Respectful. Unmoved by the attention. And as Richard looked across the ballroom filled with influential people, he began to realize that the crowd was no longer waiting for him to speak. They were waiting to hear what the waitress would say next. Richard Holloway had spent most of his adult life controlling rooms exactly like this one. He understood timing. He understood influence. Most importantly, he understood how quickly public opinion could be guided when enough authority stood behind the microphone. Yet as he stood at the edge of the stage looking across the ballroom, something felt different. The audience remained attentive, but the attention was no longer centered entirely on him. It had shifted toward Grace Mitchell. Not dramatically, not openly, just enough to be noticeable, just enough to make him uncomfortable. The string quartet remained silent. Crystal chandeliers cast warm reflections across hundreds of faces. No one appeared interested in returning to dinner. The room had become invested in something else. Richard smiled again, determined to regain control of the evening. You seem to have an answer for everything, he said. Several guests laughed politely. Grace stood quietly beside the table where she had been serving moments earlier. No, sir, she replied. Just for the questions you ask. A few people smiled at the response. Richard noticed immediately. He decided to change tactics. Tell me, Grace, he said, emphasizing her name for the first time. Do you enjoy being a waitress? The question sounded harmless on the surface. The tone beneath it was less innocent. Grace recognized it immediately. So did many people in the room. She nodded. I do. Richard spread his hands. Really? More scattered laughter followed. Because if I am being honest, carrying trays for strangers does not sound particularly fulfilling. Several guests shifted in their chairs. The comment landed differently than his earlier jokes. It felt more personal, more deliberate. Grace remained calm. Most jobs involve serving someone, she said. Richard tilted his head. Is that so? Yes, Grace answered. Some people serve customers. Some serve shareholders. Some serve public opinion. The titles are different. The principle is usually the same. The room grew quieter. Richard felt the reaction before he saw it. A few guests nodded unconsciously. Others looked down into their glasses as though considering the idea. Richard laughed lightly. That is a clever way of avoiding the question. Grace shook her head. I answered it. Richard crossed his arms. Then explain. Grace glanced around the ballroom. Her expression remained respectful. I enjoy helping people, she said. Sometimes it is bringing someone a meal after a difficult day. Sometimes it is making sure a guest feels welcome in a room where they know nobody. Small things matter more than most people realize. Her voice remained soft. Yet somehow every person in the ballroom seemed to hear it clearly. Richard looked towards several nearby tables. Nobody was laughing now. The audience was listening. That realization irritated him more than he expected. He had intended this exchange to be entertaining. Instead, it was becoming reflective. And that is enough for you? Richard asked. Helping strangers? Grace considered the question. Not strangers, she said. People. The answer lingered in the air. Simple. Direct. Difficult to dismiss. Near the front of the ballroom, an elderly donor slowly lowered her wine glass and smiled. At another table, a young entrepreneur leaned forward with visible interest. The emotional temperature of the room was changing. Richard sensed it happening in real time. He had seen public opinion shift before. Usually, he was the person creating the shift. Tonight, it was happening without him. For the first time since stepping onto the stage, he felt the faint edge of uncertainty. Grace had not argued. She had not challenged him. She had not attempted to embarrass him. Yet every answer seemed to make his questions appear smaller. And as the ballroom settled into another attentive silence, Richard found himself searching for a new question while the audience quietly waited to see whether he would ask it. Richard Holloway smiled as though he had finally found the question he wanted. The expression returned gradually, rebuilding the confidence that had carried him through decades of boardrooms, negotiations, and public appearances. Around the ballroom, hundreds of guests remained attentive. The charity gala had transformed into something entirely different from what anyone had expected. Dinner plates sat untouched. Conversations had faded. The spotlight was no longer on the foundation, the donors, or the fundraising totals. It rested squarely on the exchange between a billionaire and a waitress. Richard stepped closer to the microphone. All right, he said. Let us try a different approach. Grace Mitchell remained still beside her service station. Calm, patient, respectful. Richard glanced toward the audience before looking back at her. You seem to value people more than achievement. Grace shook her head gently. No, sir. I value achievement. Richard lifted an eyebrow. Then perhaps you can explain something. He paused deliberately. Why do some people spend their lives building extraordinary things while others remain exactly where they started? The question immediately changed the atmosphere. Several guests exchanged glances. It was sharper than the earlier questions. More direct. More personal. Richard sensed it and continued. Surely ambition matters. Surely effort matters. Surely choices matter. Grace listened without interruption. Richard folded one hand over the other. So what separates someone who changes the world from someone who simply watches it happen? The room became silent again. A few guests expected Grace to finally become uncomfortable. Others expected her to push back. Instead, she considered the question for several seconds. When she spoke, her voice remained steady. Sometimes opportunity. The answer arrived softly. Richard nodded. And sometimes. Grace met his gaze. Sometimes perspective. Richard smiled faintly. Perspective. Yes. Grace shifted the tray slightly in her hands. Many people spend their lives asking how high they can climb. Others spend their lives asking how many people they can lift. The silence that followed felt different. Several guests lowered their eyes as though reflecting on their own careers. Richard noticed the reaction immediately. That sounds noble, he said. But the world rewards results. Grace nodded. It does. Richard appeared surprised by the agreement. Then we agree. Not entirely, Grace replied. A few smiles appeared around the room. Richard exhaled through his nose. Go on. Grace glanced briefly toward a nearby table where an elderly volunteer sat beside several younger guests. Results matter, she said. The question is which results. Richard crossed his arms. That sounds vague. Grace shook her head. Not really. She paused. A business result can be measured on a spreadsheet. A human result often cannot. The ballroom remained completely still. Even the event staff had stopped moving. Grace continued. One of them is easier to count. That does not automatically make it more important. Richard felt the audience leaning toward her words rather than his. The realization unsettled him. For years he had been the person people listened to when he spoke. Yet tonight, every question seemed to create another opportunity for Grace to reveal something deeper. Not because she was trying to impress anyone, because she genuinely believed what she was saying. Richard looked around the ballroom. Faces that had laughed earlier were no longer amused. They were thoughtful, reflective, curious, and for the first time all evening, he began to sense a problem he could not solve through confidence alone. Grace had never challenged his status. She had never questioned his success. Yet somehow every answer made the audience reconsider the assumptions hidden beneath his questions. As Richard stood beneath the bright stage lights, searching for another way to regain control of the conversation, he realized the room was no longer judging Grace. It was quietly beginning to judge the person who kept trying to judge her. Richard Holloway stood beneath the stage lights and felt something unfamiliar. It was not fear. It was not even embarrassment. It was the uncomfortable realization that the audience was no longer reacting the way he expected. For years he had been the center of rooms like this. People laughed when he joked. They applauded when he spoke. They agreed when he offered opinions. Tonight, however, every attempt to diminish Grace Mitchell seemed to produce the opposite effect. The more he pressed, the more composed she appeared. The more composed she appeared, the more the crowd respected her. Around the ballroom, hundreds of guests remained silent. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished silverware and untouched desserts. The charity gala had become a lesson nobody anticipated. Richard adjusted his grip on the microphone. "You seem to have a philosophy for everything," he said. Grace smiled politely. "Not everything. Most things, then." A few people laughed softly. Grace did not react. Richard decided to take another approach. "Tell me something honestly," he said. "Have you ever wished your life had turned out differently?" The question landed heavily. It felt personal in a way the others had not. Several guests exchanged glances. Grace looked thoughtful rather than defensive. "Of course," she said. Richard immediately sensed an opening. "Really?" Grace nodded. "Everyone has moments like that." Richard smiled. "Then perhaps you understand my point better than I thought." Grace tilted her head slightly. "Which point is that?" Richard stepped forward. "That success matters. That opportunities matter. That reaching higher matters." Grace listened carefully. "I agree with all of those." Richard appeared genuinely surprised. "You do?" "Yes." Grace shifted the tray comfortably against her side. "The difference is how people define higher." The ballroom grew quiet again. Richard felt irritation building beneath his calm exterior. Every answer seemed to redirect the conversation somewhere he could not predict. "Then define it," he said. Grace glanced briefly around the room. "Higher is becoming more useful than you were yesterday." A few guests nodded almost immediately. Grace continued. "Higher is becoming more patient, more generous, more capable, more trustworthy." Richard folded his arms. "That sounds nice. But the world measures achievement differently." Grace met his gaze. "The world measures many things differently." Another silence followed. Not awkward. Reflective. Near the front of the ballroom, one donor slowly began clapping. The sound lasted only a second before stopping, but it changed the atmosphere instantly. Richard noticed several guests smiling. Others appeared deeply thoughtful. The room was no longer evaluating Grace. They were evaluating the exchange itself. Richard felt the shift more clearly than anyone. "You know," he said with a forced laugh, "most people would be nervous standing in front of this many influential people." Grace smiled gently. "Most people would. But not you." Grace looked around the ballroom. Her expression remained calm. "I serve people every day," she said. "Some have money. Some do not. Some are powerful. Some are not. After a while you realize everyone is carrying something difficult that nobody else can see." The room became completely still. Richard looked toward the audience and saw something he had not expected. Empathy, respect, admiration. None of it was directed toward him. For the first time that evening, he understood that the crowd was no longer interested in watching a billionaire test a waitress. They were watching a waitress reveal the character of a billionaire. And as that realization settled across the ballroom, Richard began to understand that every new question was making the same mistake as the first one. He believed he was exposing her limitations. Instead, he was exposing his own. The ballroom remained unusually quiet after Grace finished speaking. The silence no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to recognition. Hundreds of guests sat beneath the glow of crystal chandeliers, watching a conversation that had evolved far beyond entertainment. Richard Holloway felt it more clearly with every passing minute. The energy of the room had changed. Earlier in the evening, people had laughed because he expected them to laugh. Now they were listening because they wanted to listen. The difference bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He adjusted his jacket and forced another confident smile. "You speak as if you understand people remarkably well," he said. Grace remained calm. "I try to pay attention." Richard nodded slowly. "And where did all this wisdom come from?" The question sounded casual, but many people in the room sensed what he was attempting to do. He was searching for a weakness, a flaw, something that would return the audience to his side. Grace considered the question for a moment. "Mostly from listening," she said. Richard laughed lightly. "Listening? Yes." Grace glanced around the ballroom. "People tell you who they are if you pay attention long enough." Several guests exchanged thoughtful looks. Richard felt the reaction immediately. He pressed forward. "Then perhaps you have spent your life observing successful people from a distance." The remark drew a few uncomfortable chuckles. Grace did not appear offended. "Sometimes," she said. Richard sensed another opening. "And have you learned the secret?" Grace smiled politely. "Which secret?" "Success." Richard spread his hands toward the audience. "This room is full of successful people. Surely after years of watching them, you have discovered something." The ballroom grew quiet again. Grace looked toward the crowd before answering. "Actually, I have." Richard lifted an eyebrow. "Please, enlighten us." A few guests smiled nervously. Grace spoke softly. "The happiest people are rarely the ones talking the most about their success." The statement landed with surprising force. Richard felt it immediately. Several people lowered their eyes. Others smiled faintly, as if remembering someone important in their lives. Grace continued. "The people who seem most fulfilled are usually focused on something larger than themselves." Richard folded his arms. "And what would that be?" "Family, community, service, purpose." Her voice remained steady. "Sometimes all four." The room fell silent again. Near the center of the ballroom, one donor quietly nodded. Another guest leaned back in her chair with a thoughtful expression. Richard looked across the audience and realized something uncomfortable. No one was laughing anymore. Not because Grace was being dramatic, because she was being sincere. There was a difference. For the first time all evening, Richard felt as though he was arguing against something people genuinely respected. He glanced toward Grace and noticed something he had overlooked from the beginning. She was not trying to win. She was not performing. She was not trying to impress anyone. Every answer came from the same place. Calm conviction. That realization unsettled him. Winning against an opponent was familiar territory. Competing against sincerity was much harder. Richard cleared his throat. "You make life sound simple." Grace shook her head gently. "Life is not simple." "Then what is?" Richard asked. Grace paused. The room waited. "Knowing what matters," she said. The answer settled over the ballroom like a quiet wave. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Only reflection. And as Richard looked across the hundreds of faces watching from beneath the warm chandelier light, he saw something he had not expected to see that evening. People were no longer measuring Grace by her profession. They were measuring her by her character. And increasingly, they were beginning to measure him by his. Richard Holloway looked across the ballroom and realized he was no longer controlling the narrative of the evening. The awareness settled slowly, like a shadow moving across sunlight. Around him sat executives, investors, donors, and public figures who had spent years admiring confidence and rewarding certainty. Yet tonight they seemed captivated by something entirely different. Grace Mitchell remained standing beside a service table near the front of the room. Her uniform had not changed. Her position had not changed. Nothing about her circumstances appeared different. And yet the entire atmosphere of the gala had shifted around her. Richard adjusted the microphone in his hand. "Let me ask you one final thing," he said. The words echoed softly through the ballroom speakers. Grace nodded politely. "Of course." Richard forced a smile. "If character matters so much, why do people spend so much time chasing status?" The question sounded philosophical. Many guests immediately recognized something else hidden inside it. Richard was no longer testing Grace. He was testing whether he could recover the room. Grace considered the question carefully. She never rushed her answers. That had become part of her quiet strength. While others reacted, she reflected. Because status is visible, she said. Richard waited. Grace continued. Character often is not. The ballroom remained silent. People can see a title, she said. They can see a corner office. They can see a luxury car. They can see awards hanging on a wall. Several guests shifted thoughtfully in their chairs. But integrity is harder to see, Grace said. Kindness is harder to see. Humility is harder to see. Those things usually reveal themselves over time. Richard felt the audience absorbing every word. He attempted another smile. And yet society rewards status. Grace nodded. Sometimes. Richard immediately responded. Only sometimes. Grace looked around the room before answering. The people who truly matter usually reward character. The statement landed with remarkable force. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was sincere. Near the back of the ballroom, someone quietly began clapping. Another person joined. Then the sound faded again, not becoming applause but creating a ripple of agreement. Richard felt his stomach tighten. The reaction was impossible to ignore. Earlier in the evening, people had laughed because he directed their attention. Now they responded because Grace had earned it. He glanced across the audience and saw expressions he recognized immediately. Respect, reflection, admiration. None of it was aimed at the stage. It was aimed at the waitress standing beside a coffee service station. Richard cleared his throat. You speak as though you have spent years studying human nature. Grace smiled softly. No, I have spent years serving people. A few guests smiled. Grace continued. When people think nobody is paying attention, they show you who they are. The sentence settled heavily across the room. Richard felt it more than anyone. For the first time all evening, he became aware of how his own behavior appeared through the eyes of others. He had believed he was demonstrating confidence. He had believed he was entertaining the audience. Now he saw another possibility. Perhaps they had watched a powerful man repeatedly challenge someone who never tried to challenge him back. Perhaps that was why the room felt different. Perhaps that was why every question seemed to shrink while every answer seemed to grow. As silence returned once more beneath the golden chandeliers, Richard realized the audience had quietly chosen a side. Not because Grace had demanded their support, because she had never demanded anything at all. And standing there beneath the bright lights, he understood that the evening was no longer moving toward the conclusion he had imagined. Richard Holloway stood motionless beneath the stage lights as the silence settled across the ballroom once again. It was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence of realization. Hundreds of guests remained focused on the exchange unfolding before them. The chandeliers above cast warm reflections across polished glass and silver. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan shimmered against the night sky. Yet inside the ballroom, nobody seemed interested in the city anymore. Their attention remained fixed on two people who could not have appeared more different. Richard looked toward Grace Mitchell and forced a small smile. He understood something now that he had resisted acknowledging all evening. Every attempt to place her beneath him had elevated her instead. Every attempt to demonstrate authority had invited comparison. And comparison was becoming increasingly uncomfortable. You know, Richard said, his voice softer than before. Most people in your position would have tried to prove something tonight. Grace listened quietly. Perhaps, she replied. Richard nodded. Yet you never did. Grace glanced around the room. Because I did not come here to prove anything. The answer landed with remarkable weight. Several guests lowered their eyes. Others exchanged thoughtful looks. Richard felt the reaction immediately. He had spent years studying persuasion. He knew when words connected with people. Grace was no longer answering questions. She was revealing principles. Richard took a slow breath. Then why answer at all? Grace considered the question. Because you asked. A few smiles appeared around the ballroom. Richard laughed quietly. Not the confident laugh that had filled the room earlier. Something more genuine. More uncertain. That cannot be the only reason. Grace shifted the tray comfortably against her side. No, she admitted. It is not. The room became still once more. Then what is the reason? Richard asked. Grace looked directly at him. Her expression contained neither triumph nor judgment. Because sometimes a question says more about the person asking it than the person answering it. The sentence settled over the audience like a wave. No one reacted immediately. They did not need to. The meaning was already clear. Richard felt it more strongly than anyone. For the first time all evening, he stopped thinking about how the crowd perceived Grace. Instead, he began wondering how they perceived him. The realization was uncomfortable, yet it was also honest. He looked around the ballroom and saw faces that had followed his career for years. Investors who trusted him, donors who admired him, colleagues who respected him. Tonight they had watched him direct question after question toward a woman who never once responded with anger, never once attempted to embarrass him, never once raised her voice. And suddenly Richard understood what many of them were seeing. Grace had remained exactly the same person from the beginning. The only thing changing throughout the evening had been him. The audience understood it too. The shift was impossible to ignore now. No one appeared impressed by power. They seemed moved by restraint. No one appeared fascinated by status. They seemed drawn to character. Richard lowered the microphone slightly. The gesture was small, but symbolic. The room noticed. Grace noticed. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt like conflict. It felt like reflection. And standing beneath the bright lights of his own gala, surrounded by hundreds of influential guests, Richard began to realize that the most uncomfortable lesson of the evening was also the simplest. The person he had spent hours trying to diminish had never lost any dignity at all. The only dignity at risk had been his own. Richard Holloway lowered the microphone completely. The movement was subtle, yet it changed everything. For the first time that evening, he stopped searching for another question. The ballroom noticed immediately. Hundreds of guests remained silent beneath the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. Outside the towering windows, Manhattan stretched into the distance like a sea of lights. Inside, the atmosphere felt different from the beginning of the gala. Earlier, the room had been filled with confidence, status, and performance. Now it was filled with reflection. Richard looked at Grace Mitchell. She still stood beside the service table, holding the same silver tray she had carried throughout the evening. Nothing about her appearance suggested victory. Nothing about her posture suggested triumph. She had not tried to dominate the room. She had not tried to defeat anyone. She had simply remained herself. Richard took a slow breath. "Grace," he said. His voice carried through the ballroom with an honesty that had been absent earlier. "May I ask one final question?" Grace nodded politely. "Of course." Richard paused. The entire room seemed to lean forward. This time his expression contained no trace of performance. "How did you stay so calm?" The question surprised everyone. Most of all, it surprised Richard himself. Grace considered the question carefully. Then she smiled. "Because this was never really about me." The room remained silent. Richard listened. "People only feel humiliated when they allow someone else to define their value," Grace said. "I already know mine." The words settled softly across the ballroom. No applause followed. No dramatic reaction. Just understanding. Grace continued. "You could question my job. You could question my income. You could question my position in this room." She glanced around at the guests. "But none of those things determine who I am." Several people lowered their eyes thoughtfully. Others nodded almost imperceptibly. Richard felt the truth of her words more deeply than anyone. Throughout the evening, he had assumed that status created value. Grace had demonstrated something different. Value existed long before status arrived. For several seconds, neither person spoke. Then something unexpected happened. Richard placed the microphone on the podium and began to clap. The sound echoed softly through the ballroom. A few guests looked surprised. Then others joined. Soon the room filled with genuine applause. Not for a performance. Not for a clever answer. For character. Grace looked slightly embarrassed by the attention. She gave a small nod and smiled politely. When the applause faded, Richard stepped away from the stage. There was no speech. No attempt to reclaim the moment. No effort to explain himself. He simply walked toward Grace and extended his hand. She accepted it. The gesture lasted only a second, but it spoke louder than any words exchanged that evening. Respect had finally replaced assumption. Around them, conversations slowly resumed. The musicians prepared to play again. Guests returned to their tables. The gala began moving forward. Yet something had changed. Many people would leave that ballroom remembering more than fundraising numbers or donor announcements. They would remember a quiet waitress who never raised her voice. They would remember a powerful man who learned an unexpected lesson in front of hundreds of witnesses. Most importantly, They would remember that dignity cannot be given by status and cannot be taken by ridicule. As Grace returned to her work and Richard stood quietly watching the room around him, one truth lingered in the air long after the evening ended. The people who have nothing to prove are often the ones who teach the greatest lessons.